disaster. My name is Michelle, and I'll be helping with today's session. First, I'd like to introduce you to our presenter today. Debbie Dallin is a security expert and global knowledge instructor who has been providing technical solutions and training since 1975. Thanks so much, Debbie, for being here. Welcome, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. Today what we wanted to talk about is DRP, disaster recovery. With our disaster recovery, it's the classic, boy, I sure hope it never happens to me. And it does make most companies end up going out of business. But if you can be prepared, if you can stay agile, there's a good chance you'll stay in business. And certainly, depending on what kind of contracts you've accepted responsibility for, you may have compliance requirements that don't stop just because your company is no longer in business. So again, you have to be on top of where all of your data is located. And to any extent that you've relinquished control of it, you have to make sure that they are willing to be sufficiently compliant so that in turn you are being compliant, or you become this act of you passed it downstream, but still you're going to be held liable for any kind of an infraction. So to the extent that anyone else can access your stuff, you need to take that into account as though they were an insider and come up with what are your plans, your tolerance levels for should something happen, how long could you hobble, and how would you get back into business again. The more we go to the cloud services, not just that we are consuming them, but we are in turn providing them to our customers, we have to recognize that any moment of being down is immense catastrophic damage to our organization. So it doesn't have to be your facility. It can be simply your provider, and that website is no longer available for people to interact with. One of the more lasting issues that we have as to the damage suffered is the concept of churn. Churn, like you churn butter and it's never coming back again to be milk. Churn is what you lose and it's never coming back. And the number one on that list is your customer, particularly in a cloud world. If you're down for one moment and they can find somebody else who isn't down, they'll never even look your way again. So you need to be concerned about having everything available as well as your compliance so that you can maintain your reputation and you can maintain your organizational structure. As bad things happen, bad things will always happen. The types of disasters can be natural. Any day, pick up the newspaper, and there's tons of different types of natural disasters that we're confronting. And which type of natural disasters you could confront are certainly going to depend on where you're geographically located. But remember, again, with cloud services, it's also where your providers may be located. Then we have our man-made, wars, riots. These are the types of things that, again, people never want to look at any disasters, but it tends to be this belief that, well, but people will be good and it'll happen other places. Corporate espionage is rampant, both from outsiders and insiders. We need to be on top of the man-made issues as well. And then, of course, we have technical. Equipment just smokes one day. So as we are considering availability, we need spare parts. We need to recognize how long before the average amount of equipment is going to fail. That's the mean time to failure. What's the mean time to repair? Are you going to have enough parts to plan succession properly so that you're not caught without parts because something has failed on schedule? Now take a little bit of a standard deviation and recognize some things are going to fail before that. So again, you have to be prepared with backup equipment. You have to analyze your consumer feedback. How much is it aggravating them when something isn't available? Again, your reputation is directly going to interrelate to this idea of churn. Another one of our MTTRs isn't just mean time to repair, but mean time to respond. You need to be aware of not just those who are beholden to you as far as they're going to give you services, but those you are, I said that backwards, those you are beholding to are the ones giving you services. Those beholding to you are the ones you're giving service to. Anyway, keep it in mind both directions. Either one can erupt in your face if you're not sure that you're balancing things properly. Simple things like your power outages. Again, you're not able to supply the service that you may have promised. Well, now where are the people going to go? Do you have redundant servers, clustered servers, some type of fault tolerance with load balancers so that there's another mechanism by which people can access the service still? These fluctuations don't have to be because a power station went down or a grid went out on you. It could simply be a bad storm. So all the way around, technical is probably one of the ones that we most tend to look at. But the question would remain, are you looking at it sufficiently in depth? Your preparedness is about not just your organization, but all the organizations you interact. Remember, this web services concept is most of us are only supplying a piece of an overall solution today. And every time one of these pieces go down, the overall structure is going to have issues. Can you sustain operation if some of those on who you depend are no longer there? This whole idea of hobbling, you need to bring together critical parties out of your organization. Sometimes it's managers, sometimes managers don't sufficiently really know how the process works. So what's critical is that it's people you trust to give you viable information and to respect the kind of questions that you're asking them. The people you involve in this process are going to be very sensitive to the organization. When we are pushing out the steps that we want people to perform as a part of doing disaster recovery, it's very much on a need to know. You never know who's going to try to hit you while you're down, so you help mitigate that by only putting out the amount of information that you need to. But when they're the parties who are participating in this whole study analysis up front, they're going to know the whole picture, and they have to be very trusted employees. So you have to be able to trust what they're saying to you, and you have to be able to trust that they're going to protect the information that they're hearing. Then you're going to come up with your plans for COOP, continuity of operations. This is how you're going to hobble in spite of the fact that critical elements aren't necessarily available to you that you would normally like to make use of. So within the continuity of operations, you have lots of little steps. If this goes down, here's how you'll hobble. If that goes down, here's how you'll hobble. And in order to perform that, you've got to completely understand how all of your businesses interact with one another. When you say the widget business is our most critical business we have, well, you need to make sure that you have the supply of parts you need in order to make the widgets. You need to make sure you have the tracking. You need to make sure that you've got the ability to get them out. It's all these interdependencies that really make this a critical process where you've got to have someone that thoroughly understands how the entire piece of business that you're analyzing works. There are certainly those parts of the company I've heard people say, well, I never really liked that piece anyway, so that one isn't even going to come along should we suffer one of these disasters. That's what you've got to work up front. Just what are all of these different processes and what are the interdependencies within them. As you are, in fact, considering all the possible disasters that could occur, you want to really brainstorm on every single one to make sure you've covered as broad a territory as possible. But then you got to step back and have management come in to cut that down to a reasonable level. Now, what's reasonable to one organization may be 3 to 4, another might be 10 to 12. It depends on who you are. But that is going to be management's responsibility. Ultimately, management is responsible for the security of the organization, the safety of its employees, and for the fulfillment of whatever they've told customers they're going to do. So, as we in fact prepare to respond to disasters, keep in mind that we can't stop the disaster from happening. By definition, it was sudden, it was catastrophic. What we want to do is adapt how we will respond to it so that we can work around whatever are these interrupted services. What is defined as a disaster is an inability to perform critical system functions or critical business functions. Again, disasters are going to vary according to the organization and what they do. But your goal is to stay in business after this disaster occurred. That's a common misnomer. People think that, oh, well, getting through these initial stages of the disaster, getting into my fallback site, phew, good thing we suffered through that disaster. No, the disaster continues until you're fully back into business again in your reconstituted or your brand new facility. And at that point, now you're ready to reflect. Lifecycle management, could we improve how we managed it? So it isn't a thing you do one time. It's something you have to get into place and you constantly revisit, at a minimum once a year, to make sure it's still appropriate to how you do business. Everything about how you do business is changing daily. So as far as what you can work from, don't think that you have to make this up totally by yourself. You can Google on templates. There's a lot of them out there. NIST has special pubs, FIPS documents, but particularly their 800 series that defines how you can work to establish what the risk in your organization is and different approaches you might make in order to try to establish a DRP BCP. So as you're going forward, although there are lots of documents out there you can lean on, keep in mind there's two really bad things. One is to never have planned at all, because it's going to happen, and guess what? Everybody's going to be flailing. The second is to simply grab a template, fill in the blanks, and say, yep, check that box, because there's nothing customized to how you do business, and it's almost as bad as never having used any kind of plan in the first place. So yes, we do have templates, we do have documents out there to help you, but use them to help you. Don't use them to substitute for you doing your job. This whole process cannot be overemphasized, the need for senior management to step in and support it. That's the only way that they're going to, in fact, supply the resources you require, the investment of time, space, the definition that they will sit down and identify the scope. The whole way of working through it, you need to work lockstep with management, because they're the ones dictating what is of concern. They're the ones ultimately going to jail. So while you're doing the effort for them, it is critical that you stay in mind with what it was they wanted in the first place. They are the ones that have to approve the plans. They are the ones that need to confirm the project team, of which every member needs to sign a non-disclosure agreement. Remember again, by establishing the scope, you set the boundaries on just how far you need to go into different details and what are time limitations, all resource limitations, so that the job gets done. Your choice, qualitative or quantitative. Often people kick off a qualitative so that within a few months they have an idea of where they're going, and then they'll follow through with a quantitative, which is really going to be when the board of directors and insurance companies want to pay attention to it. So understand the BCP process. I have people get confused with, well, wait a minute, we started on DRP and now we're talking BCP. The disaster recovery process, as we speak about it in the security realm, is a piece of the business continuity plan. Many times people will drop the incident response plan into the overall BC process as well, where the difference between the incident and the DRP is simply how destructive was it. But both of them, we need to have trending, documentation, thorough details, so that we can continue on in the face of adversity. The BCP includes the business impact analysis, which is where we're going to start our next series of investigation. It includes that COOP, the continuity of operation. It includes the crisis management. It includes the communication document. Basically, BCP is the big picture of which all the other documents become a part of it. So BCP think of as a series of policies, plans, documentation, a library of resources, where the DRP is going to be stepwise. A disaster has occurred. You're going to have exactly what the configuration is, exactly where all the patches can be found, exactly where all the source code could be uncovered. I mean, everything in order to reconstruct and keep the company moving forward. The DRP is the last place where you want to say, now refer to page 5 of such and such policy, because probably that policy is nowhere around anymore. The DRP is written very straightforward, no highfalutin terms because people are freaking out. So as we look at the DRP, it's part of this overall process of BCP, and you need both, but understand how they relate to each other. Again, starting with the business impact analysis, a great synonym for the BIA would be your prioritization. What is the most critical function within your business? So as you analyze whatever disasters management has spelled out within their scope, you are perhaps going to go one by one. It helps to be extremely visual, storyboarding, bringing these people together. You're going to come up with exactly how long could they stay down, what resources do they require in order to hobble, and if in fact how long they can hobble is not quite as long as how long it takes you to get everything back up again, well then you're going to need some kind of a hot, warm, or cold site to fall back into. And you want to know which operation to get up first. That will be whatever was your most critical prioritization within the BIA. So understanding all the dependencies, understanding, again, what is the greatest revenue stream into your organization, whatever is the means by which you can say this is the most critical, the next most critical, and so forth on down the line. Storyboarding is one of the techniques to get information out of whoever's participating on the team. And as I mentioned, the more visual you can become, the greater that you're going to be able to solicit meaningful input. While in fact you bring all these people together, sometimes you want to keep their input written down, a little bit anonymous, or you can end up with some henpecking order going on in the room where someone's looking at someone else with, you better not say you're more important than me. So how you collect the input can be defined according to your organization. But the fact that you brought everybody together and you're getting a consensus, then you comb all of their input together so that now you can determine who's going to be at the top of the list. Within all of this, you have to understand what you had of value. So it's kind of a chicken and the egg thing. I need a BIA. In order to get my BIA, I'm going to have to do a risk analysis. If I'm going to do a risk analysis, I have to start off by what do I have of value. Those are your assets. It could be done by simply conducting an inventory. You could do an audit. You could do a vulnerability scan. But here's part of the difficulty. Tangible and intangible. You're going to have to put a value behind it, or you can't prioritize your different business functions. Every single asset will have vulnerabilities. You need to list all of those as well. And finally, you're going to come up with what are the threats that could do damage to those vulnerabilities. When a threat crosses with a vulnerability, we often use a multiplication sign, but we don't mean multiple because there's so many calculations that go in there. We're not really looking at the mathematical multiply. But when a threat crosses a vulnerability, that's what we call risk. So as we're figuring out our interdependencies, you're really doing a risk assessment. That brings us back to the assets with their listed vulnerabilities or weaknesses, those threats that could compromise them in the realm that we expect threats to be coming towards us. That's the threat profiling, and determining what is the amount of exposure if that threat were to be manifest. You then focus on the probability of how many times should that happen. I mentioned when the threat occurs or crosses a vulnerability, that's your risk. But not all risk is the same. When you're coming up with the countermeasures, you're going to want to start by dealing with whatever has the greatest amount of exposure and the greatest amount of probability of happening. And you're going to work to the other end of your matrix, the least exposure, the least amount of happening, and stop when you run out of money. So where in other discussions we focus on this whole aspect of risk management from the perspective of supplying countermeasures, this time we're going to focus from the costing perspective. Exactly how do you make these calculations so that you can determine whether a countermeasure is appropriate? In all lectures, the bottom line is you don't spend more money to defend something than you stand to lose. That's bad business. I remember so clearly when I was doing my early programming, I didn't get this whatsoever. I was a slide the pizza under the door, leave me alone, let me do my programming, and hey Debbie, we ran out of overtime. That's okay, I'm not going to let them win the war. And it was stupid. I just didn't get it back then. The idea that they can't afford it means it wasn't worth it to them. What was I doing still working other than my own edification? So that's the big thing to get across to IT at large is you have to deal with what is appropriate to the company and stop when it's no longer appropriate. we have everybody out there trying to grab your investment dollars, and they will grab until you have no more money left. Well, that's called a quick way to go out of business. You want to make sure you're doing your diligence to see which ones are most appropriate, most cost-effective, and therefore those will be the ones that I integrate into my environment. Basically, we need these formulas understood. As I mentioned, we use the multiply sign, but it doesn't mean multiply. It just means when it comes together. Your total risk is all of the vulnerabilities of all your assets together with what threats they might encounter. And, of course, the probability that it will really happen. We put dollars behind this, even though, like I said, there's always new risk for whatever mitigations you add. So the formulas aren't so simplistic as we suggest. But if we could just get these formulas over to broad stream IT, we would be doing a whole lot more to help protect our environment, because they would be able to distinguish what are the appropriate controls to be spending money on versus what are the controls that are ineffective and we need to get out of our environment. So, asset is in terms of dollars. Threat is a thing that when it comes and hits with a vulnerability, that threat times vulnerability is what we call risk. In terms of all of your assets, we'd call it total risk. It creates an exposure. Your exposure is in fact a percentage of your asset. So you see in our inset bullet, we refer to it as money. If your asset was worth $1 million and your exposure was 50%, well then, if you suffer this hit, you've just lost $500,000. If it can happen once every 2 years, well then each year you stand to lose $250,000. That is the maximum amount that you can in fact invest in your defenses. Not a penny over it. I've had people say, well, I might go a penny over it. Well, if that's the case, then you haven't properly explained what the true value of your asset is. You don't go a penny over it. So this is where all these formulas come into play as you figure out what is the appropriate types of mitigations to bring into the environment while never exceeding your annual loss expectancy. Surely if you're looking into a control that might be good for 2 or 3 years, well, maybe you'll look at 2 to 3 years worth of annual loss expectancy. But keep in mind how things depreciate. Keep in mind any maintenance requirements, training of people. The numbers aren't clear-cut. In fact, honestly, when I get into risk any lower than what you're looking at it now, because after all, once I got exposed to it, I thought, well, this is neat. Let's dig in deeper. I suddenly felt like when I was getting my chemistry degree. What I learned getting my degree in chemistry is it didn't matter what you made in the lab. All you had to do was be able to explain why that's what you made in the lab, and they understood that you knew the processes and you'd get a good grade. Now, take that with a little bit of a grain of salt, but that does affect the outcome of the lab anyway. The bottom line here is it's amazing to get into these numbers. People can be extremely creative. So the push is to get more and more detail. The more detail someone can supply to substantiate the numbers they come up with, the less artificial those numbers can get away with being. But it's hard to come up with the details. So again, it becomes really a huge undertaking to get the right level of detail and yet get the job done. Risk management is the overall process of coming to terms with what your risk is and then mitigating it to an acceptable level. There's all kinds of risk strategies you might assume, including management just saying, well, it's not how much risk I wanted to accept, but at least I know what it is, therefore I'll accept more risk. Down to, you know what, we really don't want to be in this line of business, I'm closing the whole company. Or anywhere in between of we need more policy and training, or we need a new firewall or IPS. The aspect of performing the risk management, as well as the aspect of coming to terms with having these documents, DRPs, your overall BCP, it shows an organization's due care. It does require due diligence, which is your research, but the opposite of due care is negligence, and negligence is prosecutable in a court of law. So to help cut down on how many times you have to go visit the judge, it really helps for management to understand the need to have a DRP properly designed and documented. This is the overall strategy we've been talking about. Within the life cycle of risk management, you had to analyze what you have, the cost benefit of all those controls you currently have in place, and the identification of other countermeasures that could either support or replace current countermeasures you've already deployed. Finally, the cost of the implementation, not just the acquisition, and a constant reflection. Is this still appropriate? Is it time to do things over again? At minimum, once a year, you need to review it because we always change how we're doing things and what business is most critical. With your analysis, expect it to be difficult because everybody's going to have a different sense of what things cost, especially insurance companies. When they're focused on the depreciation, not the replacement cost necessarily, you have to establish what you're looking for and, again, balance. If you're buying insurance, make sure you buy the right kind of insurance. It is the malicious individual as well as external and internal threats. It is tangible issues as well as intangible, making sure that all of the assets have been identified. Finally, coming up with the risk. Very hard to put a value on reputation, to put a value on the popularity of your product over somebody else's product, but that's what you have to do. As you consider threats, we were discussing the fact that it could be natural disasters, it could be equipment, but within the human realm, remember both internal and external. Especially the more we go to embedded systems and cloud computing. It changes our whole understanding of who's internal and external. Community clouds, where other companies are now on equal footing with our company. When you're defining the risk, make sure you've properly identified the exposure, because one exposure can lead to another exposure. And here again, it's going to be very important that you have a record of all of your own past experience. The probability of occurrence. You can get a little bit from reading the articles, watching the news, but again, your best experience is going to be the documentation you have from incident response and previous disasters that you've managed. As you are selecting your countermeasure, don't stop at the cost of the countermeasure. You've got to include how much it's going to impact productivity, performance, people's morale, the training that you'll have to pay for, the maintenance agreements, and how well it does or does not integrate with the rest of the environment you have. As companies, and I am really depressed, I think it's starting to go away again, but I was reading a lot of auditing journals where companies were just saying, you know, everybody's being attacked. RSA, Barracuda, there's no chance of our piddly little company being able to defend. Therefore, we'll just do nothing. We'll wait till we get attacked, and then, you know, if we go out of business, well, that's just the way it works. Well, again, there's customer opinion. Did that manager hope to ever open another company in the future? There is the lost productivity where you still might have to pay compensations to individual. The cost of doing nothing doesn't just stop at the fact that, yeah, you suffered a hit. There's the legal implication that you did not demonstrate due care, so now you can go to jail for negligence. So the cost of doing nothing, I think, as more and more cloud services are suffering attacks, is becoming clearer to people that that is not an acceptable solution. But what is your tolerance for risk is still going to change company by company. The disaster recovery plan must be written succinctly. It's going to be those steps that are followed after the disaster occurs. It needs to be in paper, 3 sets, 1 copy distributed, 1 copy maintained securely off-site, 1 copy for markup as things change. But clear and concise. You've got to recognize that critical people who have been performing critical functions may no longer be there. They may have died in whatever the nature of the disaster is. So from all scopes of whatever your operations are, you need to prepare for how are you going to both hobble and or move back into a hot, warm, or cold site. This is what will provide the availability of whatever was a critical service and was the reason for doing the BIA. As I mentioned, the scope had to be established by management. They also have to approve the order with which you say you're going to reconstruct services. When you get into whatever's your fallback site, you always first move in whatever was at the top of the BIA, your most critical service, and all the dependencies upon which it required. As we've been saying, your goal is to minimize the economic loss, decrease your exposure. All of these are fantastic steps. I'll let you read them instead of me reading them to you. But as you're providing your stability, your orderly recovery, just keep in mind that nothing's ever guaranteed. There will still be those pitfalls where things bite you, that it was worse than what you expected. But at least by having some steps, you're going to have a greater probability that people can adapt and respond to the unique situations they find themselves in. Notice this reference to insurance premiums. Here's one that I think is another kicker for people. You can buy insurance for anything you want. What you don't want is to simply grab an insurance policy because it was the lowest cost to you. As we talk about minimizing insurance premiums, what we mean is minimizing appropriately. So you don't just grab something that's low dollar only to later find out that they want to argue with you and they really don't choose to cover what you thought they were covering. It's the fact that you'll get better rates when you can demonstrate to the insurance company that you performed your due diligence and that your company will take due care. That's what allows them to therefore order or lower their premiums to you. So as we're talking about minimizing, we're not just saying running out there and finding whatever you can that's the cheapest. We mean meaningfully allowing yourself to be awarded cheaper premiums because, in fact, you understand the nature of your organization, you understand what it's going to take to hobble and survive. This reduction of reliance on key individuals is so important because typically there's only those few that of course you wanted when you were doing your DRP to make sure they were in the room. And suddenly when they're not there, nobody knows what to do. By having proper documentation, it won't be so critical that they were there. You will be able to hobble. So your proper protection means that in fact everything is as detailed as needs to be so that anybody could step in and perform this restructuring. Ultimately, to get back into complete operation, you'll need to get back trained people again. But during this interim, you're after a situation where things will kind of run themselves based on the steps of procedures that you've developed. Always number one is looking for human safety, both your employees and your customers. Then it's data, and then it's whatever else that you can help get through this disaster. Certainly you want to minimize your legal liability. I have seen for identical situations where someone has demonstrated they've done the due diligence, they've developed the due care policy and all these other documents, the judge has given them a cheaper penalty just because they demonstrated due care. Make sure that you've truly figured out everything that you need. It really stinks to be able to have a fallback site and forget that you didn't figure out how to get your people there, or that you didn't have food and shelter for them once they got there, or that you didn't have a call-in line so that everybody could be checking on what the status of affairs is so that they can ramp up and be ready when you're ready for them. You didn't know who the person was that's going to announce, hey, it's a disaster, and you didn't have a call tree in order to get that word out to all of your employees. So all of these operational dependencies are critical in having a complete solution. And I think probably the number one is actually the one listed here last, communication. I remember with the Twin Towers, afterwards people were just running in every direction with any kind of anything that could be pulled from the rubble and possibly operational. And as corporate management was coming back, they realized they didn't even know if they were their employees, let alone their equipment, and it was just mass chaos. People had their fallback site in the other Twin Tower. Turned out that most of the organizations in the Twin Tower had template disaster recovery plans where they just filled in the, the blanks. Basically, what happens during disasters is one of two things. There are certainly variations of this, but the one of two things tend to be either you find a way to hobble and survive, and now you're stronger and have even better plans for the next go-around, or you become a lesson for everybody else on what not to do if they want to survive. And the goal here is not to be a lesson for everybody else, but to be able to survive yourself. As we've been talking about what we're trying to protect, confidentiality, integrity, those are huge to be able to, again, have communication, have paths of where data can be transmitted, not transmitted, only letting people know their piece of the pie so that they can't hurt you further while you're down. It's also availability. You don't want any single point of failure. So within these contingency sites like hot, warm, cold, or having your own redundant sites, there will be a lot of costing as to which one is effective to you. But the rule is if your organization cannot hobble to the extent that it would take you to recover, then in fact you need to have this hot site to fall back to. Again, you need that COOP plan, your BIA, so you know what goes in there first, and your continuity so that they know how to hobble while they're in there. But remember, the disaster itself is not over just because you got into the site. It continues until you've moved back into your reconstituted site. At that point, you're going to move in your least critical first because your most critical is already up and running. And as you test the water and things prove to be working, well, then you move in everything. But for any point at which you don't want to suffer a denial of service, make sure you have redundant services. These written plans should not be on the computer when in fact you don't have power anymore, or where other people might be able to get access to what they shouldn't have. You want it to be written. Whoever's in overall charge of this has to be a go-getter of an individual. They have to see projects through to completion because it is a demanding job. And you need to be assured that when the time period is over, you have something that management has been being kept up to date with and will in fact be ready to sign off on. So developing a roadmap so that clearly you're meeting certain interval steps along the way can be of great help to in fact make sure everything's moving according to plan. Being detailed as you possibly can be. Nobody likes to write these copious notes anymore. But again, this will be the assurance and the level of reflection you require in order to understand just how much this business, this problem costed you. It isn't just what it cost to repair, but what was the individual doing while it was down. In order to do a DRP properly, you have to understand the entire nature of costing as to what you're going to suffer in damage or exposure. The other I want to emphasize is this distribution on a need-to-know basis, which means you clearly have to tell them why it's important, or they're back to feeling like that shroom again. So, as you are in fact distributing this, everything you can to contain information is going to be important. And that in itself you have to explain to people. I'm not telling you more because that's the nature of going through this disaster recovery. Afterwards, then we reflect and talk more about it. But, for example, on the fallback site, you don't normally put your company name out front because, again, you're advertising to the world, and we're in a fallback status right now, so please attack us. You keep everything that you can on a need-to-know. You do tell everyone you have to in order to maintain your compliance, however. No plan is proven until tested. So please take your time with these tests. We talked about bringing these groups of highly informed individuals and trusted individuals into a room so you could storyboard the nature of the disaster and receive everybody's input. Well, quite often after that you have a checklist test. A checklist you just send back to everybody. Here's what I heard you say. Please confirm. Did I leave something off? Did I exaggerate? You know, have I said everything you offered me? Then once the checklist is down, you usually bring the people back into the room again. We're past the stage of what the BIA is. We're past that henpecking order. It is just de facto now who's going to start back up first as your most critical business. You need a structured walkthrough so that you're sure that everything happens with the interrelated services in the order they need to. So you re-walk through again this time with everybody together. Now you're ready for a simulation test. Not something so cheap that it doesn't matter whether it succeeds or not, and not something so critical that it's so demanding that you're now suffering your regular operations. You want something right in the middle that will be a good reflection on whether you have a sustainable solution. The closest thing before rolling something out is called a parallel test. The emphasis on a parallel test is that you're using real live data. No matter what we construct, we often use test data to see if it's going to work. And when you bring real data in, you can have dramatically different results. So the benefit of a parallel test is for the real environment and this mock environment, you make sure you've got real data going into both. And you look for the same data coming out of both. That's parallel in, parallel out. If you're not getting the same data out of both, then you really haven't duplicated the environment the way you thought you did. So parallel tests are very important, particularly when we have processes that are data-driven, making sure that same in, same out. The best test that your plan is going to work properly is a full interruption test. Take down your site. Now that's a hard one to get management to buy into. First of all, it's a very expensive test. And next is they can be worried they're not really going to get back up into operation. This is a test that you can't necessarily perform if all you have is a warm or cold site. A warm only has some of the equipment. A cold doesn't have any of the equipment. But it's a test you need to perform periodically if you're depending upon a hot site to make sure that it truly will work for you. Now, while we want hot sites to be up before anybody knows the real site is down, we usually have a couple of hours to get it up because the belief is you might have to bring over your latest set of backups. But still, within those couple hours, we're talking about truly bringing down the original site. I've had organizations say, well, we simply disconnect the communication channel. It truly is off the internet. Fine, but that really isn't the same as shutting it down. Because what we're saying when you shut it down is we're proving you can get it back up again. And that's really an important part of the test as well. So while some companies, for compliance, they have to do a full interruption test, just because that's what their compliance demands, not because management wants it, it really is important that they truly shut down the original site, as far as I'm concerned. Now, it might be that whoever they're compliant to is happy if all they do is take it offline. That's where you have to look into your own regulatory law. But I just know the difficulties bringing things back up. And it's not that I want to, ha-ha, look at that, now you're having the difficulties. But that's truly the assurance that this will work. I can get it back up once we rebuild the environment. The fact that you were able to fall back means you're hobbling. Doesn't mean you're back in operation. The fact that you can shut down and start back up has demonstrated that when all the pieces are there, you can recommence work. That's a different level of assurance. So while it's a benefit of a full interruption, remember that nothing simulates a real disaster. In a real disaster, people are going to be freaking out. So it's critical that you have regular tests so that people can fall back on their training when in fact they are losing their sensibilities otherwise. I invite you to attend some of our other courses to learn about this subject in greater detail, and I thank you for joining with us today. Don't forget to grab your point of continuing education to keep yourself compliant with your certifications, and thanks a lot for joining us.